You may well have seen that crash barriers are back in the news. Those crash barriers are supposed to make our roads safer, but for motorcyclists they fundamentally do not work. And the reason for that is not because we're unlucky, it's basically because they've never been designed with motorcyclists in mind. As motorcyclists, we know that we only make up 1% of road users. So why is it then that we make up 19% of all fatal crash barrier collisions? That gap is what this video is all about. When a car hits a crash barrier, the chance of a driver or car occupant dying in that collision is about 1 in 70. For a motorcyclist hitting that same barrier, the chance of dying is closer to 1 in 9. That makes motorcyclists 15 times more likely to die in a collision with a crash barrier. Up to 16% of all motorcyclist fatalities involve collisions with crash barriers. So that's not a fringe problem, and the numbers haven't changed in decades. So the simple question is, what's happening and why hasn't it been fixed? Every crash barrier that is installed in the UK does have to go through rigorous testing. That testing involves collisions with cars of around 900 kilos, with buses, with HGVs up to several tons. But there is no test for a collision with a motorcycle. So every barrier in the UK can pass every single legal test and still be potentially fatal for a motorcyclist. That is not an accident. That is a gap in the regulations that hasn't been fixed. Road restraint systems, to give them their proper names, were designed to solve a specific problem. The problem of large vehicles crossing over a median into oncoming traffic. And they do perform that task well. But as we all know, a motorcycle is not the same as a car. And a motorcyclist doing an impromptu test of the abrasive qualities of his leathers as he slides along the road is certainly not an HGV. The problem is that these tests never involve a motorcycle or the rider. There is actually a European spec that covers the specifics of motorcycle protection on barriers. It was written years ago. The problem is, it's not mandatory. Nobody has to actually follow it. And that tells you really all that you need to know about this subject. Now, when people talk about crash barriers when it comes to motorcycling, the conversation normally starts and very often ends with what's called wire rope barriers, the cheese cutters. The wire rope barriers consist of solid uprights with steel cables strung between them. And the belief is that riders meeting these steel ropes are cut in half by them, the cheese cutter effect. The problem, of course, is that this fear or this concern is not actually supported by the evidence. A major study commissioned by Transport for Scotland looked at every single motorcyclist collision with crash barriers in England and Wales between the period of 1992 and 2005. And what it found was that every one of those fatalities involved collision with the uprights and not one of them with the wire ropes. At an international road safety conference in 2008, researchers from 5 countries presented their own statistics and findings, and every one of them reported the same thing: not a single incident of a motorcyclist being injured by contact with the steel cables. Every single one was as a result of a collision with the uprights. At that time, Sweden had 900 kilometres of wire rope barriers in service, and yet their data simply showed that not a single collision had taken place where the rider came into contact with the steel cables. The steel cables as the mechanism for injury is simply not supported by the evidence. It's the uprights. So what is actually killing the riders? It's not the ropes, it's the posts. And in many ways that finding is more problematic than if it was the ropes. We're all familiar, aren't we, with the saying, dress for the slide, not the ride. And it's a very good saying because it deals with the dynamics of what happens when you fall off your motorcycle. You don't go flying through the air, you slide along the road surface. When you come off your bike near one of these road barriers, you're not flying into the ropes, you're not flying into the armco. What you're doing is you're sliding underneath the wire ropes and underneath the armco into those posts. And because the angle at which you approach the barrier is not 90 degrees, it's normally closer to about 15 degrees, that means that you've got a 70% chance of hitting an upright post. The difference between hitting a post and hitting a continuous barrier is catastrophic. And that's the issue. In England and Wales, 32% of casualties involving barriers involved collision with the posts. And of those, 90% involved severe trauma to the head. So this is not a wire problem, this is a post problem. And the posts are used in every type of barrier, not just wire ropes. University research commissioned by MAG's Northern Ireland campaign established that the posts in wire rope barriers create a 5-fold increase in the severity of casualties compared to the average motorcycle collision. So the barriers that most people think are safer than the wire ropes, the ones with armco, the W-section steel rail that runs between the posts, they are slightly safer. The posts are set back further than they are in the wire rope barrier design, but the rider is still sliding underneath and hitting the post. So the question shouldn't be which type of barrier is slightly less safe for a motorcyclist. The question should be, why are motorcyclists not protected from the posts? In 2016, the Swedish Motorcycling Association presented findings to a road safety conference. But the conclusion was not to simply replace wire rope barriers with the normal armco barriers. The conclusion was that the correct response is to introduce post protection on all barrier types. So the motorcycle protection system is something that does work, and it's a very simple solution. When you look at an armco barrier, all that you're really doing is adding another lower rail to the post. This prevents that slide under effect that means that motorcyclists meet the posts. It gives you a long rail along which that impact can be spread out and you slide along the barrier as opposed to directly into a post. France introduced this system on its motorway network in 2000. Germany, the Netherlands, Portugal, Norway and Denmark have all moved in the same direction, some through legislation and some through policy. Portugal made it law that safety barriers must include motorcycle protection. Denmark banned wire rope barriers outright. The research shows that fitting these protection systems at locations where motorcyclists are most likely to come into shallow angle contact with barriers reduces fatalities at those sites by 50%. As I say, it's not perfect, but it does make a substantial difference. This is not theoretical, this is documented in the countries that have already done it. There is also a cost argument. This is rarely made, but it should be. Wire rope barriers look cheap, with just £75 per metre installation cost. Concrete barriers have negligible maintenance costs and far fewer casualties. This makes their lifetime cost much cheaper than a wire rope barrier. We didn't just campaign on this, we got research done. We went to Queen's University to their engineering faculty and we got them to produce a detailed report on the risks to motorcyclists of these barriers, and also to come up with some designs for better impact protection systems. In 2020, MAG's man in Northern Ireland, Martin Boyd, took everything we had gathered in terms of evidence and marched into a meeting with the Department for Infrastructure and the relevant minister. This was a meeting, a proper meeting. It wasn't a social media campaign, it wasn't a petition. At that meeting, the Department for Infrastructure accepted formally and on the record that these barriers are indeed a risk to motorcyclists. They also committed to promoting motorcycle impact protection systems in locations that are defined as high risk. They also agreed to work with universities such as Queen's to develop better and safer barriers. Then in January 2021, they actually changed the regulations too. These new regulations in place mean that any new barriers that go in must be rigid barriers, not wire rope. The regulations also state that any wire rope barriers that need repairs or replacements must also be replaced with rigid barriers. The wire rope barriers already in place have been put on the clock. They've been given a 20-year lifespan, and after that period they have to be replace two with rigid barriers. Martin Boyd, who led the campaign at the time, said that this was the beginning of the end for wire rope barriers, and it's important to make that distinction. This isn't a wholesale removal of the barriers, but the regulations have been changed, which meant that over a period of time these barriers would become a thing of the past in Northern Ireland. But of course that was Northern Ireland. In the rest of the UK we're still waiting. And of course we have to remember that the UK does not have one single roads authority. We've got National Highways that deals with the strategic road network, we've got Transport for Scotland, we've got Transport for Wales, we've got local authorities. All of these bodies need to be convinced that they need to change the barriers. Effective campaigning means knowing which door to knock on. Whilst social media campaigns and petitions may look very tempting, they don't necessarily produce the change that we need. So MAG's campaign has three realistic asks. First, that motorcycle impact protection systems are installed on all newly installed barriers. The second ask, beyond the new barriers that become installed, is mandatory retrofitting of motorcycle impact protection systems at all identified high-risk locations. Third ask is that the voluntary technical specification for motorcycle impact protection systems becomes mandatory, not just mere guidance. We want to make motorcycle safety a legal requirement, not an optional extra. Now, the UK government did publish a new road safety strategy in 2026. It doesn't specifically address this issue, but the policy window is there and we should be fighting for it. National Highways have been asked to account for rider safety as part of its network management responsibilities. MAG is already having the conversations with these bodies, trying to make sure that this issue is dealt with properly once and for all. We're not asking for full-scale removal of these wire rope barriers, we're not asking for anything unreasonable. We're asking that motorcyclists are involved in the processes and we get the proper recognition that we need when it comes to road safety. Every other road user group gets this. It's about time that motorcyclists got it too.